Hello, Tara here. We're on chapter 26 of The Bridge to Belle Island. There's only 28 chapters total, so only 3 chapters left. Here we go. Isabel had crossed the river and come out on the other side. She had survived the ordeal. And how long would she live now that she had left her island? Only God knew, but she planned to live each day, each month, each year he gave her to the fullest. Though always aware of the taut cord binding her to Belle Island, she spent time in London with Rose while the floodwaters lingered and the legalities related to recent deaths were resolved. Rose decided to forgive Christopher Adair and stood by him through his course Kate. The experience seemed to mature Adair appreciably. To everyone's relief, he was acquitted in the end, thanks to some excellent legal work by Benjamin and the skilled barrister he engaged, along with the testimony of his coroner brother, who declared with renewed resolve that a blow delivered in self-defense by slight, boyish Adair would not have proved fatal to anyone. I guess that's kind of an insult and compliment. I'm not sure how he felt about that one. You couldn't have killed anyone. Armed with her father's most recent will, Benjamin and Mr. Hunt, a competent solicitor, appealed to the Court of Chancery for the dissolution of the Wilder Trust, returning control of the estate to Isabel and Rose. After sorting through all of the papers, bills, investments, and accounts Percival had left behind, they discovered that while he himself was on the verge of bankruptcy, the financial condition of the Wilder estate was not as bleak as he, likely planning to pocket more money for himself, had led Isabel to believe. So she would have sufficient funds for repairs as well as a new bridge and workshop. Although he had not seen Hardy since the man boarded Redknapp's boat, Mr. Booker had felt duty-bound to inform Officer Riley that Robert Hardy had confessed to poisoning Percival Norris. Out of a remnant of loyalty, however, he refrained from mentioning the shove off the roof. Isabel had overheard part of their rooftop conversation, but not enough to fully corroborate Benjamin's testimony. Because no one else had heard the whole of Hardy's confession, and they had little other proof, Benjamin doubted a jury would convict him. But the Marine police, who had long pursued Enos Redknapp and his band of smugglers, intercepted his sailing barge with Hardy on board. Redknapp's men, in a bid for lesser charges, agreed to give evidence against their leader. They also told officials that Robert Hardy had, under Redknapp's threatening persuasion, confessed to killing his former partner and had also agreed to use his position as successor trustee to secure the use of Belle Island for Redknapp and his crew if they let him live. With this evidence, along with statements from Mr. Booker and Isabel, the courts indicted Robert Hardy for feloniously killing and slaying Percival Norris. He was taken to Newgate Prison to be held until trial. Enos Redknapp, indicted for grand larceny, violent theft, tax offenses, and more, was held there too. Before the trial date, Robert Hardy was killed in prison, poisoned. Whether by Enos Redknapp himself or a bribed guard was unclear. Either way, Redknapp soon met his fate on the scaffold, unrepentant. On an especially hot summer afternoon, Mr. Booker came to St. James's Square to tell Isabel the news of Mr. Hardy's death in person. She had seen him from time to time since returning to town, but their conversations had been limited primarily to legal matters. Isabel listened to his account, then said, "I am sorry, Mr. Booker. I know you cared for Mr. Hardy, despite his recent crimes." "I did, thank you. You may think it wrong of me, but I am oddly relieved. Not for my sake, but for his. For a man like him, months of his name being vilified in the newspapers, everyone dissecting the scandal and his trial, followed by a public execution." He shook his head, a grimace on his handsome face. If he had to die, better to die quickly and with as little rumor-mongering as possible. This way his daughter can put it behind her far sooner and try to go on with her life, which I know he would have wanted. Isabel was not sure a loving daughter would agree, but understood the sentiment. For a moment Mr. Booker held her gaze, and seemed about to say something more. but he quickly shifted his attention to his brief bag and asked some question about the estate. She believed the sentiments he'd expressed on Belle Island had been sincere at the time, but his warm, romantic words about caring for her and hoping their story was just the beginning had been spoken in the midst of danger. After the danger passed, had he begun to regret them? As he had said, they had known each other less than a fortnight, and nothing of his surprising declaration could have been construed as an offer of marriage. He had not committed himself. They were both free to go back to their relationship as lawyer and client, apparently. She felt bereft at the thought. Suppressing a sigh, Isabel answered his question, and he moved on to explaining the revised terms of Rose and Adair's marriage settlement. She considered hinting about their own relationship, but now that he was back in his beloved London, he'd likely decided that a future between them would be fraught with insurmountable obstacles. She had been relieved to spend time with Rose in London without paralyzing fear, but had no desire to live there long term. Belle Island was her home. Sometimes she still shook her head in disbelief that Teddy had thought he could convince her to move to Edinburgh. Did Mr. Booker know her better? Had he realized it would be futile to ask her to live in London? If so, he was right. Isabel sadly shook her head at the realization. As much as she admired Benjamin Booker, she would probably turn down such an offer. So she accepted his retreat without pressing him. Nor did he raise any objection a few weeks later when she mentioned her plans to return to the island soon, having received a promising report from Arminda about the receding floodwaters. Perhaps it was for the best, she told herself. It would cause less heartache for all involved if she departed quickly. But her conscience smote her for the lie. Her heart ached already. Leaving Rose in the care of Miss O'Toole and the Adairs, Isabel returned to Belle Island by hired boat. She contracted builders to begin construction of a new bridge and workshop without delay, and then spent the rest of the summer and much of autumn overseeing those projects as well as working on repairs to the house and tenant cottages. A stonemason was able to repair the statue of the woman feeding swans. Despite her scars, she was still beautiful. It was lonelier on the island without Teddy and Lottie, and without a bridge to connect her to Arminda and the other villagers, who'd become such an important part of her life. Carlotta and Evan had married not long after the flood. The two had moved to Bristol, where he found work, and she began singing again, but they promised to visit as soon as they could. With Theodore Grant gone to Scotland, Riverton was without a doctor, and the villagers had to travel to Maidenhead for medical care when the need arose. The empty office in Riverton was being advertised at a good rate, and Isabel hoped to soon find another physician, or at least a surgeon or apothecary, willing to move to the area. While the new bridge was being built, a resourceful Joe asked permission to use her old boat, which had been left in Riverton and damaged in the flood. With her blessing, he had it repaired using the wages he'd earned weaving baskets, and started a ferry service to bring people to and from the island. He told Isabel he'd read about such ferries in a book. She patted his shoulder and told him how proud of him she was, assuring him Mr. Booker would be impressed too when he heard about it. Isabel wasn't certain she would be seeing much of Mr. Booker in the future, at least socially, but he was still her lawyer after all. After allowing some time for the news of his trial and acquittal to die down, Mr. Adair and Rose finally named a new date for their wedding that had been postponed due to legal uncertainties. Her niece's every letter contained hints of Christopher's deepening character and love, and Isabel began to believe the young couple would have a happy life together. They planned to marry just after Christmas. So, in early December, Isabel returned to London to help her niece prepare for the big day. On a mild December afternoon, Benjamin went to see his parents. For months he had been so busy preparing cases for court that he had only been able to steal away from the office for brief visits. But now he had a whole afternoon free. He would not, in fact, be spending his days in the offices of Norris, Hardy, and Hunt for much longer. Mr. Hunt, as the last remaining principal, announced plans to dissolve the firm in the wake of recent events, though he had asked Benjamin to enter into a new partnership with him. Ben hailed a hackney coach to take him as far as Westminster Abbey, and then walked the rest of the way, enjoying the cool, crisp, sunny day. Fastening the buttons of his greatcoat against the breeze, he walked by St. Margaret's Workhouse and the Greycoat Hospital School, and then followed Rochester Row past a tobacconist, butcher's shop, printer, and bookseller. When he reached his boyhood home on Willow Street, he pushed open the apothecary door to familiar smells and the sound of the bell ringing in his arrival. He warmly greeted his mother and father, and the three exchanged news. Then, longing to be out of doors after so much time spent poring over law books, Benjamin volunteered to work in their physic garden, which raised his parents' eyebrows, but no objections. In the small plot behind the shop, warmed by afternoon sunshine absorbed by the garden's stone walls, Benjamin culled the last of the year's harvest and prepared the garden for winter, cutting back plants and raking up the rows of spent stalks and wilted fronds to add to the compost heap. He gathered the few useful seed pods and roots he'd found into a basket and carried it inside. The basket reminded him of Isabel, of course. Then again, most things did. Inside the shop, he found his father handing a paper-wrapped parcel to a customer. The stocky man of about his own age turned at his entrance, revealing a stained apron. The man's square face lit up. "Well, if it isn't Benny Booker! Haven't seen you in years!" Benjamin hesitated. "I am sorry. Do I know you?" "Don't you remember me? Davy Paulson, a too frequent patient of your father's, always getting into some scrape or other as a lad. One time I managed to cut off part of my finger with a cleaver." Recognition dawned. "That I do remember. I am glad to see you well. A nasty injury, as I recall." "No lasting damage." He lifted his hands, showing all 10 digits. "You and Mr. Booker did a first-rate job saving the finger. My parents always said so." Benjamin shook his head. "I did nothing." "That's not how I remember it," Davy said. He laughed. "Then again, I had lost a great deal of blood." Benjamin glanced at the butcher's blood-stained apron, the awful memory returning. "Still in the family business, I see." "That I am. I have taken over the shop for my pa. Perhaps you heard?" "I had not. Congratulations." Davy nodded, his face cheerful if weary. "Well, I'm no lawyer, but the missus and I do all right. Or we will, once we get our youngest over this colic. None of us have slept through the night all week." He lifted the parcel, thanked Mr. Booker, and took his leave. As the door shut behind him, his father's parting smile faded. Gazing vaguely into memory, he said, "I'll never forget how he struggled to stop the bleeding. I was so afraid I'd fail and he would end up losing his finger, or even his life." Benjamin looked at him in surprise. "I didn't know you were afraid. You hid it well." Although his angry frustration with Benjamin at the time had been plain enough. His father shrugged. "Doesn't do to show fear. Not to a patient, and certainly not to his frantic parents." Benjamin hesitated. Should he broach the long-avoided subject? He took a deep breath and said, "I've always regretted how I failed you that day, running off as I did. Truth is, I was terrified, afraid he would die, and it would be my fault. I tried to put pressure on the wound, as you said, but my hands were shaking so hard I could not." His father nodded, then frowned. "I handled things poorly, I know, snapping at you like that in my panic. Wasn't your fault. A boy your own age, a severed appendage, and so much blood. It's no wonder you were shaken by it." Benjamin crossed his arms and managed a sheepish smile. "After that, I did everything I could to avoid being asked to assist again." His father regarded him with interest. "Is that why? I wondered. It was about the same time you began complaining of dizziness. I admit I sometimes thought it was an excuse to get out of work. No, sir. In fact, vertigo still plagues me now and again, at the most inconvenient times." "Then forgive me for doubting you." "Happily. And I hope you will forgive me. You were right about Mr. Hardy. I'm sorry I did not heed your warnings. And for so much more." It's all forgiven, all in the past." His father considered, then said, "I hope you give me grandchildren one day so I can have a second chance to do better. And if you experience the challenges of raising adolescents yourself, you may be more understanding." He grinned wryly, and Benjamin returned the gesture. He wondered if he would ever have the chance to be a father. He hoped so too. His father added, "In the meantime, we shall have to try harder to find a remedy to help you." "Thank you, sir." But somehow, Benjamin felt better already. Later, he sat with his mother in the family's private quarters behind the shop, kitchen on this floor, sitting room and bedchambers above. Together they lingered over cups of tea and savory rosemary scones. His father was busy in his surgery with a patient. Benjamin was glad they were reconciled, but also grateful for some time alone with his mother, for a chance to finally unburden his soul to the kind woman who knew him so well. He had previously given his parents a brief account of what had transpired on Belle Island as it related to Mr. Norris and Mr. Hardy. Now his mother listened in patient silence as he described everything else that had happened, though he said nothing outright about his feelings for Isabel. When he finished, his mother studied his face and said, "You love this, Miss Wilder, don't you?" Benjamin looked at her in surprise. How had he given himself away? He faltered, "I do care for her, yes, though I suppose that is foolish to say after so short an acquaintance." She spread expressive hands. "A brief time span, perhaps, but what an eventful one! You two have been through so much, working together, learning to trust one another, facing danger and almost losing your lives. I'd say you know each other better than many couples who have been acquainted for far longer. Does she admire you too?" Looking away from his mother's probing gaze, he fiddled with a stray rosemary needle among the crumbs on his plate. "Even if she did, I have little to offer her." "What are you talking about? Mr. Hunt has offered you a new partnership." "True, but I live here in London in a small apartment while Miss Wilder lives on Belle Island. You should see the place, Mamma. It's beautiful." His mother tilted her head to one side. "Perhaps I shall see it one day. But right now, I am more interested in your Miss Wilder." "She is not my Miss Wilder," Benjamin replied, feeling his neck heat. His mother sent him a knowing grin. "Maybe not yet." Ben looked down into his teacup, but saw only Isabel's face. "She is pretty and intelligent and capable. She cares about people. Not only her family, but her tenants and neighbors, especially those less fortunate. She is everything a gentlewoman should be, with no airs or vanity. She is a real lady, Mamma. I am not good enough for her." She pressed his hand. "Don't make that decision for her. That is for her to say. Where is she now?" "She has recently returned to town." When Benjamin had delivered the final copy of the new marriage settlement to Mr. Adair, the young man mentioned Miss Wilder's arrival with apparent pleasure. Benjamin had been surprised to hear it. To come to London after literally being swept off the island was one thing, but to return by her own volition? He was impressed anew by Isabel's courage. Though to his mother he said only, She is here helping her niece prepare for her upcoming wedding." "Will we get to meet her?" "Oh, I don't know about that, Mamma. I would not get your hopes up." She smiled. "Too late." I like his mom. She seems like a nice lady.